The air across southern Italy in 73 BC was thick with something worse than summer heat. It carried the smell of death, charred estates, bloated corpses left to rot under the Mediterranean sun. Now picture yourself as a Roman senator, a man who has never once questioned his place at the top of civilization, waking to the sound of screaming, not from the battlefield, from your own household. The people you owned, the ones you barely considered human, are coming for you. And they are not coming to negotiate. Erase everything the movies taught you. Spartacus was no freedom fighter with a clean conscience and a noble speech. He was a weapon, sharpened inside the most savage training grounds Rome ever built, baptized in the gore of gladiatorial combat, and set loose with a single instinct: destroy everything the Republic holds sacred. What he unleashed across the Italian peninsula wasn't a rebellion. It was a systematic campaign of psychological devastation against the most powerful empire the ancient world had ever seen. And the worst part? Rome built him. Every lash, every cage, every forced kill in the arena. They took a man, stripped away his humanity, and were somehow shocked when the monster they created turned around and bit. Spartacus didn't just gather runaway slaves. He assembled an army of gladiators, fugitives, and men who had already accepted death. And that made them impossible to stop. He crushed elite Roman legions led by seasoned commanders. He captured Roman officers and made them bleed in their own arenas, forcing them to fight each other to the death while former slaves watched and roared. The hunters became the hunted. The Senate, for the first time in generations, tasted real fear. This is the true, unfiltered story of the Third Servile War. A brutal collision of genius, revenge, and the terrifying transformation of a man who had absolutely nothing left to lose. Before we walk into the blood-stained sand of the arena, I want to see where this army is gathering. Drop your city and country in the comments right now. Hit subscribe and help us keep pulling the darkest truths out of history's shadows. You're watching Ancestral, the best dark history channel in the world. The fruit of Roman cruelty ripened in the most unlikely of places, a gladiator school in Capua, where the walls themselves seemed to sweat with old blood. In 73 BC, the Republic sat fat on the backs of millions of enslaved souls. Senators debated philosophy over roasted peacock, while miles away, human beings were being sculpted into killing instruments for public amusement. And no place on Earth refined that process with more cold precision than the ludus owned by Lentulus Batiatus. This was not a training camp. It was an assembly line of death. Men entered as prisoners. They came out as weapons, and when those weapons broke, they were dragged out by the ankles and replaced before the sand dried. Batiatus had a system. He bought the fiercest captives Rome's wars could produce. Thracians ripped from their mountain villages. Gauls dragged south in chains. Germanic tribesmen who had watched their families burn. He crammed them into stone cells barely wide enough to stretch their arms, where the air was a permanent cocktail of sweat, infection, and fury. They ate enough to stay dangerous. They were beaten enough to stay obedient. And every single day, they trained to kill with surgical efficiency. How to open a throat, how to split a rib cage, how to put a blade through armor at the exact angle that severs the artery beneath. Armed guards watched them around the clock. Iron gates sealed every corridor. Rome was absolutely certain these animals were under control. Rome had never been more wrong about anything. Buried inside that cage of killers was a Thracian who did not belong with the rest. His name was Spartacus. He was not some feral savage captured mid-rampage. He was a trained soldier. He had marched inside the Roman military system itself, learned their formations from the inside, studied how their supply chains moved, understood the psychology that held their legions together and the fractures that could tear them apart. The Republic had essentially taken a man with the mind of a general, beaten him into a corner, handed him a blade, and surrounded him with 70 of the most lethal fighters on the continent. It was the single greatest miscalculation in the history of the ancient world. While other gladiators burned their rage against the bars, Spartacus burned his into something far more dangerous: patience. He watched the guards. He counted their steps. He clocked every rotation, every shift change, every moment the sentries looked the other way. He catalogued the weak points of the gates, the thickness of the doors, the distance between the armory and the sleeping quarters. He was not building toward a riot. Riots are emotional. Riots are messy. Riots get crushed by Roman discipline in minutes. Spartacus was engineering a tactical breach. He began recruiting in whispers. 2 Gallic fighters, Crixus and Oenomaus, both covered in the scars of 100 arena battles, became his inner circle. They spoke different tongues, but shared a fluency in one universal language: the language of men who have already accepted they might die tonight. Together, they handpicked 70 fighters. The plan was clean, fast, and merciless. Hit before they can react. Take everything. Leave no one standing. But conspiracies have a shelf life. Someone talked too loudly. Someone flinched at the wrong moment in front of a guard. The timeline collapsed overnight. Spartacus realized the Romans were moving to purge the cells before the plan could launch. Every hour of careful preparation had just been compressed into a single, desperate window. It was now or it was never. The armory was sealed. Steel swords, tridents, shields, everything a gladiator knew how to wield sat behind iron locks and armed sentries. They had nothing, so they pivoted with the instinct of men who had spent years improvising ways to survive inside an arena. The 70 broke routine and stormed the ludus kitchen. Cooks screamed and scattered like rats. The gladiators did not pause for a single breath. They grabbed everything: heavy iron cooking spits, cleavers designed to split cattle bones, pots of oil still boiling over open flames. The first guard came through the kitchen door with his gladius drawn, expecting a minor disturbance. He was dead before he finished his first step. A rusted iron spit punched clean through his neck and nailed him to the door frame behind him. Blood hit the stone floor in a spray that painted the walls. In that one act of violence, something irreversible happened. The illusion cracked. The idea that these men were property, that they could be contained, controlled, disposed of, it died on that kitchen floor with the guards still pinned to the wood. They poured into the corridors like floodwater through a broken dam. It was slaughter at arm's length. Cleavers bit through leather and bone. Iron pots caved in skulls. The gladiators bled too, badly. But 70 men with absolutely nothing left to lose generate a kind of violence that organized soldiers simply cannot match. They stripped the dead of their weapons: daggers, short swords, keys. They smashed through the main gates and erupted into the streets of Capua under open sky for the first time in years. The citizens of Capua saw the impossible. The creatures they had watched kill and die for entertainment were now standing in their streets, drenched in Roman blood, armed with stolen steel. Local magistrates scrambled. A garrison of city militia was thrown together and sent to stop the escape. It lasted minutes. These were town guards, merchants and clerks with spears. facing men who had been professionally trained to kill since the day they were captured. Spartacus and his fighters cut through them like a blade through wet cloth. That first street victory delivered something more important than survival. It delivered logistics. They intercepted a supply wagon carrying military-grade weapons bound for another gladiator school. The kitchen spits hit the dirt. Real armor went on. Roman breastplates, forged gladius swords, heavy oak shields. They shed the last traces of the arena. They were no longer gladiators. They were soldiers gearing up for war. But Spartacus understood momentum better than anyone in that group. Freedom meant nothing if Rome caught them in the open. The Roman war machine moved slowly. But once it woke up, it moved with the weight of an avalanche. He needed terrain. He needed a position so brutal to assault that numbers alone would not matter. His eyes found the answer on the horizon. A dormant volcanic giant cloaked in wild overgrowth and ringed by vertical cliffs. Mount Vesuvius, the mountain in 73 BC, was not the famous destroyer it would later become. It was silent, overgrown, and savage. Its slopes choked with dense vegetation, jagged rock faces, and ravines that could swallow a column of soldiers whole. For a conventional army, it was a logistical nightmare. For guerrilla fighters with nothing to lose, it was a fortress designed by nature itself. The gladiators climbed hard and fast, scaling the brutal terrain until they reached the summit caldera. They fortified. They rested. They waited for Rome's answer. That answer came wrapped in arrogance. When reports of the Capua breakout reached the Senate, the reaction was not alarm. It was annoyance. 70 escaped slaves did not warrant a serious military response. Dispatching elite legions against runaways would be an embarrassment to the dignity of the Republic. So, they sent a politician. Praetor Gaius Claudius Glaber, a man far more interested in career advancement than actual combat, was handed 3,000 hastily conscripted militiamen. Farmers, shopkeepers, men who held spears the way children hold sticks. This was the force Rome deemed sufficient to end the problem. Glaber arrived at the foot of Vesuvius and liked what he saw. One narrow, sloping path led to the summit. The rest of the mountain was wrapped in sheer cliffs that no human being could descend. He did not bother attacking. Why waste Roman blood on cornered animals? He simply blocked the only exit, pitched a fortified camp at the base of the trail, and settled in to wait. Starvation would do his work for him. His men lit fires, poured wine, and laughed at the idea that this assignment would earn Glaber a triumph back in Rome. It was the most elegant, effortless siege imaginable. On the summit, reality was closing in fast. Wind cut through stolen armor. Bellies cramped with hunger. Water was gone. Some of the men muttered about charging straight down the path. A suicidal rush into Roman steel, but at least a death on their feet. Spartacus said nothing. He walked to the edge of the cliff face. The side Glaber had dismissed entirely because no sane person could survive the descent. He looked down into the void. Then he looked at the wild grapevines crawling thick and stubborn over the rim of the caldera. And something clicked. He ordered every man to start cutting. They harvested hundreds of heavy, fibrous vines. Working in total silence beneath a moonless sky, they braided them into massive ropes, testing each one for strength, anchoring them to deep-rooted trees along the cliff edge. Spartacus gripped the first vine himself. He stepped backward off the edge and began lowering himself down the sheer rock face. One slip, one snapped fiber away from a fall that would scatter him across the rocks below. He vanished into the dark. One by one, 70 armed men followed him down, silent, invisible. descending the side of a mountain that Rome had declared impossible. They hit the ground undetected. They gathered in the darkness behind the Roman lines. Glaber's camp lay ahead of them, quiet, lazy, facing entirely the wrong direction. The sentries stared up the mountain path. The tents were neatly arranged. The militia slept like men who believed the war was already won. Spartacus gave the signal. The night split open with a sound no Roman in that camp would ever forget. A roar that came from everywhere and nowhere at once. The gladiators crashed into the rear of the encampment like an avalanche of iron and rage. There were no formations. There was no time. Tents exploded into flame, turning the darkness into a hellscape of orange light and black smoke. Men were killed in their sleep. Men were killed reaching for weapons they would never touch. Panic spread faster than the fire. Militia soldiers stumbled into the open only to find screaming, blood-soaked killers already inside the perimeter, hacking through everything that moved. Glaber woke to chaos. He staggered from his tent into a scene that could not exist. His impenetrable siege shattered, his army dissolving, his men dying in the dirt around him. The praetor of Rome did the only thing left. He ran. He abandoned his soldiers, his honor, and his camp, and disappeared into the night. The destruction was total. 3,000 Roman militiamen, routed, scattered, or butchered. Spartacus stood in the wreckage of Glaber's camp, chest heaving, soaked in the blood of men who had called themselves his masters. He had not just beaten a Roman force, he had made a Roman commander flee in the dark, like a common thief. And he had seized everything: food, gold, equipment, and a massive stockpile of real military weapons. The image of Roman dead, stripped bare and rotting at the foot of Vesuvius, traveled across Italy faster than any messenger could ride. But it did not land in the Senate halls first. It landed in the places Rome preferred to forget existed. The sprawling southern plantations where enslaved men worked until their bodies broke. The sulfur mines where life expectancy was measured in months. The hidden camps where fugitive shepherds survived like animals. The invisible foundation of the entire republic heard a single, impossible truth crack through the silence. The masters bleed just like we do. Tools dropped. Overseers were strangled with bare hands. Fields were set ablaze. And they marched toward Vesuvius, toward the Thracian who had done what no one believed possible. They came in waves, dozens, then hundreds, then thousands, escaped plantation workers, deserting soldiers, hardened criminals with nothing left. Desperate men and women who had been told their entire lives that Rome was invincible and had just learned that was a lie. Within weeks, Spartacus was no longer leading a band of fugitives. The camp on Vesuvius swelled beyond anything he could have predicted. 10,000. 20,000. The hills echoed with the noise of 40,000 furious, armed human beings forging weapons and demanding retribution. This was no longer an escape. It was no longer even a rebellion. It was a swarm, a massive, volcanic eruption of human rage, threatening to consume the entire southern half of the Italian peninsula. Before we witness what happens when this army of the damned tears into the Roman countryside, I need to speak directly to those of you who understand what you are watching. This is raw, unfiltered history, the kind that does not get taught in schools and does not survive on platforms without your direct support. If you want these stories to keep coming, uncensored and uncompromised, then step up. Look below this video and join our membership, The Lineage. This is not charity. This is a pact. You get early access to every investigation, exclusive deep dives the public never sees, and your name permanently etched into the ranks of the people making this channel possible. If you respect the craft behind what you are watching, prove it. Join the lineage. Take your place in the archives. Spartacus stood on a ridgeline above the valley, watching an ocean of torchlight stretch to the horizon in every direction. 40,000 killers waited on his word. He knew this new reality changed everything. The days of Rome sending politicians with borrowed soldiers were finished. The Senate would stop pretending this was a police matter. Battle-hardened generals would be pulled from the frontiers. Real legions, the professional, iron-disciplined war machine that had crushed nations, would be aimed directly at him. The age of easy victories was over. The war of total annihilation was about to begin. Winter descended on the Italian peninsula in late 73 BC, and the cold did absolutely nothing to slow the wildfire Spartacus had started. What had begun as a fortified hideout on a volcanic summit had mutated into something Rome had never seen: a mobile nation of the dispossessed. 70,000 human beings now moved under his command. The logistical weight of feeding, arming, and directing that many desperate souls would have crushed any ordinary leader within days. The sprawling camp reeked of wood smoke, unwashed skin, and meat roasting over open flames, livestock seized from the smoldering estates of Roman aristocrats. The noise alone was overwhelming. A dozen languages collided in the dirt as Thracians argued with Gauls, Germans sharpened blades beside Italian peasants, and thousands of crude weapons were hammered into shape on improvised anvils. Spartacus moved through the chaos with eyes that never stopped calculating. He could see what his men, drunk on their own victories, refused to acknowledge. Every day they stayed in Italy was a day closer to extinction. The Roman Republic was not a single beast. It was a hydra. Spartacus had severed the head nearest to him. The local garrison forces, the militia commanders, the arrogant praetors. But the real monsters were still overseas. Professional legions hardened by years of foreign warfare served under generals like Pompey in Spain and Lucullus in the east. Those wars would not last forever. The moment those veterans set foot back on Italian soil, 70,000 untrained rebels would be fed into a meat grinder with mechanical precision. Spartacus understood this with a clarity that bordered on prophetic. His plan was brutally rational. March north, smash through anything in the way. Cross the Alps. Once over those frozen peaks, the army would scatter, every man disappearing into the tribal wilderness of Gaul and Germania, returning to homelands Rome could never reach. They would dissolve like smoke before the legions could close the trap. But an army forged in rage does not respond to logic. Crixus, the massive, battle-scarred Gallic gladiator who had bled alongside Spartacus since the kitchen floor of Capua, wanted no part of retreat. Crixus looked at the burning Roman countryside and saw an empire on its knees begging to be finished off. Why flee north into freezing mountain passes when the wine was flowing, the gold was piling up, and the road to Rome itself lay wide open? He did not want survival in some distant forest. He wanted to march straight into the Senate chamber and watch the Republic choke on its own ashes. The split was inevitable. The arguments inside the command tent turned vicious. Two predators, forged in the same arena, now pointing their blades in opposite directions. Spartacus demanded discipline and strategic withdrawal. Crixus demanded total war and eternal glory. Neither would bend. In the spring of 72 BC, Crixus gathered his loyalists. 30,000 Gauls and Germans broke away from the main column, packed their stolen weapons, and marched south toward the wealthy farmlands of Apulia. Spartacus watched them go without a word. He did not plead. He did not argue. He understood the cold mathematics of what had just happened. Crassus had let his hunger for vengeance override every tactical instinct he possessed. And the Senate was counting on exactly that kind of fracture. Rome had finally stopped pretending. The embarrassments of the previous year had burned away every last trace of aristocratic complacency. The Senate reclassified the slave uprising from a regional disturbance to an existential threat against the Republic itself. In 72 BC, they activated the highest tier of military authority. Two newly elected consuls, Lucius Gellius Publicola and Gnaeus Cornelius Lentulus Clodianus, were authorized to raise full consular legions. This was no longer a militia operation. This was the Roman war machine at scale. Thousands of professional soldiers, equipped with interlocking tower shields, razor-edged gladius swords, and heavy iron-tipped javelins, filed out through the city gates in perfect lockstep. The sound of their boots striking paved stone in unison was the sound of a civilization deciding something needed to die. Consul Gellius found Crassus first. The Gallic army was easy to track, slow, bloated with wagons of stolen silver and heavy clay amphorae of wine, leaving a trail of burned villages and chaos that a blind man could follow. Gellius caught them near Mount Garganus. There was no tactical genius on display, no ambush, no flanking maneuver. This was a direct, grinding collision of force against force. The Roman legions deployed with terrifying silence. They locked into formation, a solid, breathing wall of curved shields and sharpened steel. Crassus and his 30,000 fighters roared, beat their weapons against their chests, and threw themselves at the line in a berserker charge. It was a massacre from the first impact. The disciplined Roman infantry absorbed the wave, stepped forward as one body, and began the mechanical rhythm that had conquered half the known world. Step, thrust, step, thrust. The formation moved like an industrial engine, processing human flesh with horrifying efficiency. The Gauls fought with everything they had: raw fury, brute strength, absolute disregard for their own survival. And none of it mattered. Courage does not defeat engineering. The killing went on for hours. 30,000 rebels were systematically destroyed in the mud and blood of southern Italy. Crassus died on the front line, cut down and hacked apart. Roman soldiers severed his head from his body and raised it for the army to see. The rebellion had just lost its second most dangerous mind. The news reached Spartacus in the north. 30,000 dead. His former brother dismembered. The numerical loss was devastating. But it was the psychological damage that truly threatened to unravel everything. Fear began seeping back into the ranks. The myth of Roman vulnerability, the very idea Spartacus had built his entire movement on, was fracturing. If Crassus and 30,000 warriors could be annihilated that cleanly, what chance did any of them really have? Spartacus needed to act immediately, not with a speech, not with reassurance. He needed to deliver a psychological counterstrike so savage, so fundamentally violating to the Roman identity, that it would paralyze the Senate with a terror deeper than any battlefield defeat could produce. He ordered his men to sweep the surrounding countryside and drag back 300 living Roman prisoners, soldiers, patricians, wealthy landowners. He had his men construct a crude wooden arena in a cleared field, and then he delivered the most exquisite inversion of power the ancient world had ever witnessed. The captured Romans were stripped of their armor, their fine clothing, their dignity. They were handed rusted swords, splintered spears, and warped wooden shields. Then they were shoved into the center of the dirt ring. The command was simple: fight each other, to the death. Anyone who refused would be burned alive where they stood. The world flipped on its axis, the untouchable masters of civilization. Men who had lounged on imported silk, debating abstract philosophy, were suddenly screaming, weeping, and desperately stabbing their own countrymen in the dirt just to survive 60 more seconds. Trained Roman soldiers, conditioned to fight as a unified machine, sobbed as they hacked the limbs off men they had served beside. And surrounding them, packed shoulder to shoulder on the improvised stands, 70,000 scarred, filthy, liberated slaves drank wine from stolen golden cups. They cheered when heads rolled. They wagered on which senator would collapse first. Spartacus sat above it all, watching the empire consume itself for his entertainment. He gave them the authentic gladiator experience. Every humiliation, every dehumanization, reflected back at Rome with compound interest. It was a funeral tribute to Crassus, and it was the most psychologically devastating act of warfare ever conducted against the Roman Republic. The account of those funeral games tore through the Capitol like a plague. The Senate understood in that moment that they were not dealing with a mob. They were facing a commander who understood Roman psychology better than most Romans. Panic devoured the ruling class. The two consuls, Lentulus in the north, Gellius riding high off his destruction of Crassus, agreed on a single coordinated strike. Lentulus would position his legions to block the northern escape route toward the Alps. Gellius would drive up from the south. Spartacus would be caught between them, hammer and anvil, and ground into nothing. Spartacus read the trap before the jaws could close. He understood the fatal flaw in their plan. It depended on both armies arriving simultaneously. Break the timing, and the trap becomes two separate, vulnerable targets. He exploited the one advantage his army had over Rome's heavy infantry: speed. Unburdened by supply trains and siege equipment, his force could cover ground at a pace that Roman commanders could not match or predict. He drove his army straight at Lentulus in the north. He did not wait to be surrounded. He struck first. The collision was catastrophic. The rebel army, hardened by a brutal winter, fueled by rage and the fresh memory of Crassus rotting in the dirt, hit Lentulus with coordinated, devastating aggression. Spartacus dismantled the Roman flanks. He shattered their defensive formations. The pristine consular army buckled, then broke. Thousands of Roman soldiers dropped their weapons and fled in blind terror, abandoning their sacred eagle standards in the mud. Spartacus did not stop to breathe. He wheeled his entire exhausted, blood-drenched army 180 degrees and force-marched them south, directly into the path of Gellius. The second consul was expecting to intercept a retreating, demoralized enemy. Instead, he walked straight into a storm. Spartacus struck before Gellius could fully deploy. The second Roman army was surrounded, cut apart, and systematically destroyed. Shields splintered, lines dissolved. Legionaries died in clusters, unable to form the very formations that were supposed to make them invincible. In the span of days, a man who had been property 18 months earlier had done what no foreign king, no rival general, no barbarian warlord had ever accomplished. He had faced the combined, concentrated military power of the Roman Republic and annihilated it completely. 2 full consular armies, destroyed. Their weapons, their supply trains, their war chests, all of it absorbed into the rebellion. Spartacus surveyed the swollen mass of his army. His numbers had exploded again. 120,000 people now followed him. The camp overflowed with captured Roman wealth. Wagons groaned under the weight of silver coins, polished armor, and exotic fabrics. But Spartacus looked at that prosperity the way a doctor looks at a tumor. This was the same disease that had killed Crixus. Wealth made armies fat. Fat armies moved slowly. Slow armies died. He gave an order that stunned even his own commanders. Every piece of unnecessary plunder, every wagon of gold, every bolt of stolen silk, every decorative trophy was thrown into a massive fire. He ordered the slaughter of every pack animal that was not essential for transporting weapons. Then he turned to the thousands of Roman prisoners sitting under guard, consuming food and water his army could not spare. The calculation was instant and merciless. The order was given. Thousands of defenseless captives were executed. Their bodies were left in mounds beneath the open sky. Spartacus carved his army down to its purest, deadliest form. No baggage, no luxury, no mercy, no weight that did not serve the single purpose of killing. 120,000 people transformed from a bloated, vulnerable horde into a lean, fast-moving engine of annihilation. And they turned south, plunging the Italian peninsula into a darkness it had never known. Before we reach the catastrophic final act that transforms the Appian Way into a 200-mile monument of human agony, I need to point you toward the research behind what you are hearing. These details are not invented. They are drawn directly from the historical record, the same sources that formed the backbone of this script. If you want to go deeper, if you want to hold the full weight of this story in your hands, look at your screen right now and hit the View Products button. Inside, you will find a definitive archive of ancient military horror, the exact maneuvers, the psychology, the brutal realities of the slave wars laid bare. And while you are there, explore the full collection. We have assembled a vault of dark historical artifacts, immersive research tools, and collector pieces for those who take this subject seriously. Secure your copy, build your library, then come back, because we are about to descend into the worst of it. When the reports finally reached Rome, 2 consular armies annihilated, thousands of prisoners executed, the rebel force now larger than ever. The Senate chamber collapsed into something beyond politics. It was primal. Senators wept openly. Military veterans who had built entire careers on projected strength suddenly discovered reasons to avoid public life. The Republic had no armies left on Italian soil. It had no commander willing to step forward. The most powerful civilization in the history of the world was staring at its own extinction, paralyzed by a single Thracian gladiator who had turned their own cruelty into the weapon that was devouring them. The wealthy began packing. Estates were abandoned. The unthinkable was no longer hypothetical. Rome was on the edge of collapse. Then the heavy doors of the Senate chamber swung open, and a different kind of predator walked in. He was not a war hero. He was not beloved. He was the wealthiest man in Rome. A man who looked at human lives the way an accountant looks at inventory. Driven by an ego that dwarfed the buildings around him and a greed that had no visible floor, Marcus Licinius Crassus surveyed the room full of broken, weeping senators and offered to purchase the war. He would fund it, he would command it, and he would end it. But the methods he was about to introduce would make even Spartacus pause. Rome was about to meet its most dangerous weapon, not a sword, not a legion, but a man who understood that cruelty, applied with financial precision, could break anything. Marcus Licinius Crassus was not a brilliant tactician. He was something far more terrifying, a man with bottomless wealth, zero sentimentality, and a pathological need to be remembered forever. In 71 BC, the Senate handed him supreme command of the slave war, not out of confidence, out of desperation. Every other option was dead, disgraced, or hiding. Crassus did not bother requesting public funding. He raised 6 fully equipped heavy legions entirely from his own fortune, and folded in what remained of the shattered consular armies Spartacus had already humiliated. But Crassus understood something the Senate did not. Numbers alone would not solve this problem. The Roman soldier had been psychologically dismantled. These men did not see Spartacus as an enemy commander. They saw him as something closer to a natural disaster. Unstoppable, inevitable, fatal. Crassus needed to rewire their fear, and the method he chose had not been used by the Roman military in living memory. Decimation. He assembled the surviving cohorts of the defeated legions and stripped them of their weapons. He divided them into groups of 10. Each group drew lots. The man who pulled the short straw was condemned to die. Not by an executioner's blade, but by the hands of the 9 men standing beside him. Crassus forced soldiers to beat their own tent mates to death with heavy wooden clubs. Try to sit with that for a moment. These were not strangers. These were men who had shared bread, marched through rain together, bled in the same mud. And now they were standing over their friend's body, clubs slick with brain matter, while a Roman billionaire watched from a raised platform without a flicker of emotion on his face. The sound that filled that camp, wood on bone, screaming that turned to wet choking, then silence, echoed for miles. The message landed with surgical precision. Crassus looked at his traumatized army and installed a new operating principle into their nervous systems. The man behind you is now more dangerous than the enemy in front of you. Spartacus felt the change immediately. The Roman army stopped behaving like the clumsy, overconfident force he had been dismantling for 2 years. They stopped chasing. They stopped making reckless charges into terrain they did not control. Crassus moved like a constrictor, shadowing the massive slave army at a calculated distance, fortifying every camp as if it were a permanent fortress, refusing to commit to open battle unless the ground itself favored his heavy shields. The era of exploiting Roman arrogance was over. Spartacus was now fighting a man who felt nothing and calculated everything. The Thracian pivoted. He marched his enormous force to the jagged southern tip of the Italian mainland, into the rocky, isolated region of Brutium. His strategy was to abandon Italy altogether. He brokered a massive deal with Cilician pirates, paying them a fortune in plundered Roman gold to ferry his entire army across the narrow strait to Sicily. The island was a tinderbox. Millions of enslaved workers labored on sprawling agricultural estates under conditions barely distinguishable from death. If Spartacus set foot on Sicilian soil, he could spark a fresh servile war, multiply his forces beyond anything Rome could contain, and establish an independent stronghold surrounded by open water. The army reached the coast. They stared at the horizon. They waited. 1 day, 3 days, a week. The sea remained empty. The Cilician pirates had taken every coin and vanished. The betrayal landed like a fist to the chest of 70,000 people at once. The psychological collapse was immediate and total. They were pinned against the ocean with nowhere to go. Behind them, the full weight of a reorganized Roman military machine was closing in. Spartacus had led his people into a geographic coffin. Crassus did not rush. He did not need to. He simply ordered his engineers to seal the lid. Across the entire width of the Brutium Isthmus, 40 miles from the Ionian coast to the Tyrrhenian shore, Crassus constructed a siege fortification of staggering scale. His legions dug a trench 15 feet deep and 15 feet wide, cutting the peninsula in half like a surgical incision. Behind the trench rose a solid timber wall bristling with watchtowers and manned by thousands of archers. He had effectively walled Spartacus and his entire army inside a prison, with the ocean at their backs and no door out. Winter fell on the trapped rebels without mercy. The barren rocky coastline offered nothing: no crops, no game, no forage. Supplies evaporated. Hunger became a living presence in the camp, gnawing through morale faster than any Roman blade. Men butchered their own pack animals and boiled the leather straps of their armor just to put something in their stomachs. Disease swept through the overcrowded, freezing encampment in waves. Crassus sat comfortably behind his wall, watching the single greatest threat to the Roman Republic consume itself in slow, agonizing starvation. But a man who has survived everything does not die quietly in the cold. Spartacus waited for the worst possible night, a blinding, howling snowstorm that turned visibility to nothing, and launched the breakout. His men did not attempt to scale the wall. They charged directly into the frozen trench. On Spartacus's command, they threw everything they could find into the ditch: bundles of timber, dead horses, and the stiff, frozen bodies of their own comrades who had already starved to death. They built a bridge of corpses. The entire army scrambled across, clawing up the mud embankments and slamming into the Roman palisade with the blind, absolute violence of men who had nothing left to lose. The blizzard blinded the Roman defenders. The sheer concentrated fury of the assault punched through a section of the wall. Crassus's line buckled and broke. Spartacus dragged his surviving forces back onto the Italian mainland. But the army that emerged was not the force that had entered Brutium. Starvation and siege had cracked its unity beyond repair. Two large groups of Gauls and Germans splintered off, convinced they could survive better alone. Crassus ran them down without hesitation, destroying them in a series of fast, ruthless engagements that left thousands more dead in the dirt. The end was now visible to everyone. Spartacus knew his numbers were critically low. And then came the intelligence that sealed the timeline. Pompey, the legendary Roman general, had just returned from Spain and was force-marching his elite veteran legions south to finish the rebellion. Crassus was desperate to crush Spartacus before Pompey could arrive and steal the glory. Spartacus was desperate to meet his end on his feet with a sword in his hand, rather than nailed to a Roman cross. Both forces converged near the banks of the Salarius River. There was nothing left to plan. No more retreats, no more clever maneuvers, no more geography to exploit. This was the final act. Spartacus assembled what remained of his army. They were skeletal, scarred from a dozen engagements, caked in blood both old and fresh. Across the open plain, the polished formations of Crassus's heavy infantry stood in perfect geometric order, shields locked, javelins raised, armor catching the sun like a wall of mirrors. The silence before the collision was the loudest sound any of them had ever heard. Spartacus ordered his war horse brought to the front of the line. Every surviving fighter watched as their commander drew his sword, turned to the animal, and opened its throat in a single stroke. The horse collapsed in a wave of blood. He turned to face his army. His voice carried across the ranks like a blade through still air. If they won today, he would ride home on any Roman horse he chose. If they lost, he would not need one. There was no retreat built into that statement, no contingency, no negotiation, only steel and the men standing on the other side of it, and the absolute certainty that most of them would be dead before the sun moved another inch. The slave army charged. It was not a coordinated military advance. It was a tidal wave of human desperation crashing into the most disciplined fighting force on the planet. The impact was seismic. Shields exploded. Spear shafts snapped. the front lines compressed into a suffocating corridor of slashing blades and dying men where no one could tell whose blood was on their hands. Spartacus did not command from behind. He locked his gaze on a single point, the command banners of Marcus Licinius Crassus, deep behind the Roman formation. The Thracian lowered his head and began cutting a direct path through the heavy infantry with the speed and savagery of a man who had spent years killing for Roman entertainment. 2 elite centurions moved to intercept him. He destroyed them both in seconds. His blade, a blur of violence that opened armor like paper. He was getting closer, carving deeper into the Roman formation. A one-man siege engine driving toward the richest man in the Republic. But the machine was too vast. A heavy javelin punched through his thigh and dropped him to one knee. Roman soldiers closed in from every direction. Even on his knees, even with his blood pooling in the dirt beneath him, the Thracian did not stop. He raised his splintered shield and kept swinging, severing hands, opening throats, forcing the soldiers around him to pay for every inch in Roman blood. He fought until the shield disintegrated. He fought until the sheer mass of bodies and iron overwhelmed what was left of his physical form. He was stabbed, pierced, and torn apart beneath a mountain of Roman steel. His body was never found. The Romans had destroyed him so completely that no identifiable piece remained on the battlefield. The man who had made the greatest empire on earth tremble simply ceased to exist, leaving behind nothing but an indestructible legend. The battle was a slaughter. Tens of thousands of former slaves died on the banks of the Silurius. But Crassus was robbed of his perfect victory. Pompey arrived from the north just in time to intercept and butcher the fleeing survivors, then immediately dispatched a letter to the Senate, claiming that while Crassus had fought the war, it was Pompey who had truly ended it. The rage that consumed Crassus was volcanic. He had spent his personal fortune, decimated his own soldiers, and nearly died, only to watch a rival politician write himself into the final line of the story. Crassus demanded something permanent, something so visually overwhelming and psychologically scarring that no one in the Republic would ever forget who had paid the price to save Rome. He took 6,000 surviving prisoners from the defeated slave army. He marched them to the Appian Way, the great paved artery connecting Capua to the gates of Rome itself. Over 200 miles, Crassus erected 6,000 wooden crosses, one every 100 feet. A human being nailed to each one. For weeks, anyone traveling the most important road in the civilized world walked through an unbroken corridor of agony. Rotting flesh, clouds of flies, and the raw, hoarse screaming of men dying by inches from dehydration and slow suffocation. The stench blanketed the countryside for miles in every direction. It was not a punishment. It was a message carved into the landscape itself. The Republic looked at that endless procession of crosses and understood with absolute clarity the terms of the world they lived in. Spartacus had made the empire bleed, but Rome always collected its debt. The Third Servile War ended not with silence, but with 200 miles of screaming. And then, finally, the deafening quiet of total, irreversible fear. Thank you for making it to the end of this journey. If you want to keep descending into the darkest, most visceral chapters of human history, you need to subscribe right now. Hit the like button. Share this with someone who still believes history is just peaceful dates and polite treaties. Show them what actually happened. You have just watched another premium documentary from Ancestral, your ultimate dark history destination on YouTube. Do not stop here. The descent continues. Look at the video appearing on your screen right now. Click it. Watch it immediately. It is the next step in your dark history education. I will see you in the trenches.